Dr. Karen Lewis is an associate professor of architecture at The Ohio State University, whose research and teaching address how visual and information systems shape the architectural, territorial, and infrastructural space they create and inhabit. She has held fellowships at Dumbarton Oaks, the Newberry Library, and through the National Endowment for the Humanities to study the 19th century visualization strategies, maps, and graphic tools of the transcontinental American West. She has also written and lectured about the ways archives hide and structure knowledge through their architecture, environment, and user interfaces. Her book, Graphic Design for Architects, positions issues of architectural representation through the lens of information design and visual communication. Professor Lewis's visualizations of the Underground Railroad were featured in 2022 in Crossings, Mapping American Journeys, an exhibition at the Newberry Library, which visualized 3 stories of men and women who escaped slavery and created their underground railroads. Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. It's truly a pleasure to be here. And thank you, all of you who are beaming in from your homes. Thank you for taking the time to come talk with me tonight. It's really such a pleasure to be, quote unquote, here at the History Center, Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. I'm just really honored to be invited and included in all of this. And I want to thank George and, of course, everybody at the History Center. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge and thank Ohio State University and the Newberry Library who have supported this project financially, intellectually, creatively. I also want to thank my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Jim Ackerman at the Newberry Library, and also 2 of my colleagues, John Davis and Thijs van Massakers, who co-taught this very first seminar with me. And of course, I can't give a talk without acknowledging and thanking all of just the amazing students who have taken studios, been in seminars, independent studies, joined me for research projects over the summer. There's so many incredibly inspiring and thoughtful conversations I've had with my students. So I just am so thankful to be able to share all of that with you today. I want to begin tonight's talk with a short trip to Southern Ohio, to a small town named Ripley, located along the Ohio River, which was the dividing line between enslavement in the South and freedom in the North. Ripley, Ohio, and this entire surrounding region of Southern Ohio is kind of known today for its abolitionist history. So as we begin our journey tonight in Ripley, Ohio, to understand how the Underground Railroad as a history is told, I want to open up some questions for us about how we understand the Underground Railroad and how it functioned. So the first stop on the National Park Service Underground Railroad in Ripley begins at the John Rankin House, National Historic Landmark, which is located on the highest elevation in town. Built in 1829, the house sits in a wide clearing on a bluff overlooking the Ohio River. Standing next to the home of one of the most well-known anti-slavery activists of the 19th century, visitors can survey the breadth of the river, the dissected bluffs of the Cumberland Plateau, the rolling hills of the Kentucky bluegrass beyond. For more than 40 years, the Reverend John Rankin and his family conducted over 2,000 individuals escaping slavery by way of his parsonage. The lights from Rankin's house kind of acted as a lantern, a pinprick of light providing both signal and navigation for the enslaved men and women who would cross the dark Ohio River from Kentucky to Ohio. From the riverbanks, fugitives would make their way through the town to a staircase known as the 100 Steps to Freedom, to Rankin's house on what he named Liberty Hill. Rankin and his family would then conduct fugitives from this home to the next available station, which would be either a house or a church or a barn or even nearby caves. The freedom seekers would wait, gain strength, create distance before enacting the next phase of their escape. So standing at the beautifully restored Rankin House, surrounded by a pristinely mown field and gazing at the landscape beyond, one cannot help but feel deeply reassured by the idyllic vista. The oversight and organization of home and landscape, township, river, and history is carefully crafted through National Park Service management and interpretation. And what I find it is a highly organized way to begin learning about a very difficult history. So we often learn about the Underground Railroad from the point of view of the people or the states and laws that abolished slavery. And the tour of Ripley is no different. So beginning at the Rankin House, our education starts through the eyes of a watchful conductor, a well-known and respected community member, church leader, and national celebrity. So from this very orderly vantage point, we're ready to receive anybody who arrives at our well-lit home. So the starting point for a tour about the Underground Railroad positions a visitor squarely as a land-owning abolitionist, ready to receive fugitives or deflect kidnappers from the comfort of our land, our house, and our view. It's a privileged position, both spatially and socially. And it's an interesting way to begin the tour, because from this vista, we can see all of the components at once. We understand the spatial relationships between towns and landmarks, streams and valleys, clearings and structures, all a part of the sequence of spaces related to moving from enslavement to freedom. It provides a type of all-knowing orthographic projection similar to the type Rebecca Ginsburg describes in her powerful essay, Escaping Through a Black Landscape, which conceptualizes the difference between 19th century whites and Blacks' understanding of landscape. As she has written, quote, enslaved workers knew the land through a different set of cognitive processes than did whites, that enslaved people's views of their surroundings assumed less of a God's head perspective than did male planters' views in particular, and that the enslaved workers' territorial systems were typically more fluid and incorporated more fine-scale details than did those of elite whites, end quote. So standing here at Rankin's home and scanning the scene beyond, the individual, at least visually, is lost within this larger, very broad spatial frame. So I want to propose a kind of thought experiment for us as we dive into this topic tonight. Suppose we reorder the spatial sequence of the National Parks tour, and instead of beginning on the bluff, we start on the banks of the Ohio River, at the bottom of the Freedom Stair, at the edge of downtown Ripley. And from this perspective, the river dominates our field of vision. And so our vista is not of distant hills and broken plateaus, but instead of the immediate conditions of the water. It is from this observant and careful lookout that John Parker, a Black man who purchased his own freedom from enslavement, scanned the river to bring fugitives from the water out of slavery and helped also conduct them towards freedom. So he read the, quote, fine scale details, end quote, of his environment. Parker worked as an extractor, moving up along the Ohio River, searching for men and women who needed help, sometimes even crossing into Kentucky to help people escape. So working as individuals, and I think sometimes together, Rankin and Parker form a fascinating spatial relationship between water and bluff. And this is a kind of exemplary, as some landscape historian Cheryl Jennifer LaRoche has described, is the geography of resistance. Rankin as the unconcealed white abolitionist and beacon of hope and freedom high at the end of the Freedom Stairway, Parker as the silent African-American operator at the more dangerous water's edge, providing immediate access to that freedom. But both were strategically situated at the water's edge, offering maximum aid and optimal security through either vantage or seclusion, which are two consistent landscape features of the Underground Railroad synonymous with the geography of resistance. And one last time, let's reorder the spatial sequence of our tour again. And instead, we began the tour in Kentucky, on the banks of the Ohio River looking north, gazing at Ripley from the shores of a state that permitted the enslavement of human beings. The eyes of our beholder is no longer that of a land-owning, unconcealed abolitionist, but that of a watchful, careful woman who enacted her own freedom the night before. Eliza Harris holds her baby in her arms, moving quickly out of the view of her pursuers and waiting for the right time to begin her escape. What might we see and what might we know in that sequence of spaces that would reframe and change our understanding of the Underground Railroad? And it's this set of questions of perspective and perception, of position, both socially and spatially, that prioritizes those enabling freedom or those enacting it themselves. So, how do we visualize the story? And what are the implications of these perspectives? Do we begin our tour through the eyes of John Rankin or John Parker, Eliza Harris, maybe her enslavers? Each perspective carries different interpretations. So with this awareness in mind, I will share two projects tonight that kind of explore these themes in greater depth. The first is the story of an historic house in Columbus, Ohio, that holds several legacy imaginaries within Ohio and the Ohio State University. And these stories challenge the ways we look at how we speak about slavery and what stories we carry forward into the present. And the second is a project I developed for an exhibition at the Newberry Library curated by Jim Ackerman, titled Crossings, Mapping Americans' Journeys. This short animation that I developed for the exhibition was to describe how freedom seekers mapped their way from enslavement to liberation. And the cartographic pivot point between all of these threads can be traced back to this map, drawn by Wilbur Henry Seibert at the end of the 19th century. So just like myself, Wilbur Seibert was a professor at the Ohio State University. And in 1898, he published a book containing maps that depicted the first systemized vision of the routes enslaved people used to escape across the Ohio River and into the free North in Canada. Seibert spent decades of his career interviewing Black men and women who fled slavery through Ohio, as well as recorded accounts of the agents, nearly 3,000 white landowners who sheltered fugitives in their homes. Though not the first recording of those who escaped slavery, that work was completed by a Black man from Philadelphia named William Still, which there's a fabulous book about his work just recently out this year. Seibert's work is acknowledged as the first academic practice. And all of his research and questionnaires and letters and written notes and interviews are digitized and preserved by the state archives. Seibert's map, though compelling and seemingly very well documented and recorded, because after all, Seibert collected all of those testimonies through painstaking interviews for most of his career, leave many stories untold, which is the criticism of his scholarship. And though he did tremendous work to interview and collect and map these stories, he tended to overemphasize his white abolitionist colleagues and downplay the work of the Black men and women who were escaping slavery. This painting by Charles T. Weber was exhibited at the Chicago World's Fair in the late 19th century. And Seibert traveled to the fair and saw this image when he visited the Columbia Expo in 1893, which was also during his first years of teaching at Ohio State. And this painting depicts this idea that the Underground Railroad was sort of operated by these kindly, benevolent Quaker families, and that the men and women escaping slavery were kind of beleaguered and just needed their help so very, very much, which is, as contemporary scholarship has told us, quite a myth. So if Seibert's map doesn't communicate the breadth of all of these routes, how can we untangle the experience from the representation of the line? Which leads me into my first research question, which I know feels very nerdy and architectural already, but let's get into it, which is what types of spaces comprise the Underground Railroad? This was my first kind of beginning research question. Luckily, I did not have to look very far to find out about these spaces, as there is a branch of the Underground Railroad running across Ohio State's campus. And this was the beginning of the class that I co-taught with Tyus and John in the fall of 2020. Beginning at the Olentangy River, one of Ohio's main waterways, there are 5 little signs that wind their way through the campus, which kind of trace the now culverted Neil Run stream. And this is all kind of outlined in yellow. The first sign is located along the river. It kind of indicates that those seeking liberation moved north along the river until arriving at this little branch of this stream, where two towering sycamore trees would verify the route to safety. Then, as the signs kind of narrate as they march across the campus, the stream would lead freedom seekers across the boggy lowlands of the Neal family farm, passing by structures and orchards and fields until arriving at a house sited above the Iuka ravine. And it was there at that dwelling, enshrouded in thick vegetation overlooking the branching stream, that the Neal family homestead welcomed those traveling the freedom train, as the signs narrate. So the house itself absorbed freedom seekers, concealing their presence in hidden walls and secret passages until successfully delivering them to the shores of Lake Erie and on to freedom in Canada. It is a nice story. It is also a story that is completely false. Installed in 2006 by the Ohio Staters, a philanthropic alumni and student organization, the signage is very difficult to verify. University Facilities has no knowledge of the signage, and the campus landscape architects have not responded to any of my inquiries about the sort of, how did this project come to be? And the signage is so subtle that even the alumni group sponsoring them does not recognize the project on their website. And the only record of the signs within the university archives that I have found is an email attachment containing an invoice for their installation. So in taking a closer look at the history ascribed on the signs, I realized, of course, this is now not being timed so beautifully with my explanation. I thought I had this all beautifully done, but just give me a second. So in taking a closer look at the histories described on the signs, I realized that the stories that the signs were describing were not about the places or the people where the signage was located, but rather it was describing things that happened in other locations, which, if you think about it, that's a really funny thing for a sign to do. We don't usually put a marker at a place to talk about something that happened 100 miles away. So, for example, the second sign, the narrative about John Rankin and John Parker, who I just shared with you, the signage claims that these men directed freedom seekers to the Scioto River. However, I can't find any mention of the river in any of the sources. I can't find mention of the Neal Run as part of the Underground Railroad or of the sycamore trees that the signs suggest. And while the rest of the information on the sign is factually accurate, and this is where my little red lines, like if I took out the red lines or took out those little sentence fragments that I've crossed out in red, all of this is factually accurate. During the 19th century, the Neal Run ran easterly through a landscape that's now the campus of The Ohio State University. Yes, that's very, very true. All of these things are true, but there's just a little bit of a twist to some of this interpretation that actually results in a cascade of difficulties. So all of this puzzles me and asks me to think, why are these signs located here? And why are these stories being told on university lands? Yeah, so now I got that right. So you can empathize. So by 1812, Columbus, Ohio was surveyed and laid out, and soon selected as the new state capital. It was selected because it was centrally located, very well connected through transportation and stagecoach, and the city quickly grew through the simultaneous development of government and civic infrastructures, which established the new capital as an economic and social center for the state. William Neal was an entrepreneur who came from Kentucky. He found opportunity within the city's burgeoning infrastructure. He obtained regional mail delivery contracts, established the Ohio Stage Company and the Neal Moore Stage Line, and helped found the very first Columbus Railroad. His prosperity led him to purchase 300 acres of land north of Columbus in 1827, where over the next 4 decades he acquired even more land, established a farm, and built several homes for his family. The Morrill Act established the Ohio Agriculture and Mechanical College, which is now Ohio State University, in 1873. So the college trustees purchased the Neal Farm as the new university site. noting that the campus, being centrally located, but strategically located away from the bars and the gambling houses permitted within the Columbus city limits. The farm also featured bogs, woods, and existing freshwater spring, which would provide adequate water for the new academic population. And it's this conflation of landscape and water is where the mythology of the Underground Railroad finds its strategic foothold within the Ohio State campus imaginary. So as previously mentioned, the first sign connects the Neil Run Spring with the Olentangy River, thereby linking the origin story of campus with fugitive movements north. And then as the signs wind along the campus's low-lying areas, passing by the lakes, the sycamore trees, the bygone bogs, it suggests a path from the river to sanctuary. And the last sign, located at the Ohio Union, marks the site of the original William Neal home and describes the continuation of this route beyond the campus grounds to the safety of the main family homestead, which I have there highlighted in red. Topography continues the story into the Iuka Ravine, which is a distinct landscape that breaks the very level, gridded ground of city and campus. Historically, the ravine and the stream were important in the placement of the brick house William Neal built for his family in 1856. The home on the hill, as it was known, was renamed Indianola by William's youngest son, Captain Henry Neal. An early enlister in the Union Army, Henry was wounded during the 1862 Battle of Iuka near Indianola, Mississippi, which is a site known for its curative spring waters. After the war, Henry took ownership of the brick house, and during this time, before the Civil War, it is presumed that the house became part of the Underground Railroad. This word presumed is where the history of the Underground Railroad, Ohio State's campus, and the Indianola house become grossly unsubstantiated. So the Neal house still stands on Indianola and 15th Avenues and is currently occupied by the Kappa Sigma fraternity, who's been a marvelous partner in this project, I should say, which states on its website, the house's history is muddled, but speculations have been made. Indianola was said to be used as an Underground Railroad station by use of hidden tunnels in the house. So the house's reputation as an Underground Railroad station is given further credence by a palette of what I call mysterious pochés. And this is an architectural term that means the thickness of walls. So secret panels, non-architectural walls, tunnels, hidden rooms, secret passages are all described across decades of sources, and you can see some of those highlighted here. One of the strangest and most confident speculations asserting that the house was a station is the claim that a tunnel extends from the Olentangy River all the way to the Neal house. So over and over again, articles recite the presence of a tunnel that begins in the furnace room, which reportedly at one time ran all the way to the river, serving as a means for smuggling fugitives from the river into the house. The tunnel is now blocked off, but winter months reveal its path because the snow tends to melt far more quickly on the roof of the underground passage than on the surrounding area, end quote. But this is a very dubious statement. It was first published in the Columbus Dispatch in, I think, the 1840s, and I'll show you a bit of that in a second. But it's been carried forward many, many times. Just last week, the student newspaper cited an article talking about the tunnels leading to the house. So there's no verification that a tunnel ran from the house to a river. And aside from questions about who would have constructed a mile-long tunnel in 1856, the paternalistic idea that men and women escaping slavery made it hundreds of miles into Ohio and through so many impossible threats to at long last reach the Neal Run, that safety would be provided by an underground tunnel owned and operated by white abolitionists undermines the agency and ingenuity of the Black men and women escaping slavery. The house itself is cloaked in many different identities. First, as a Swiss-style chalet built for Robert Neal. The house is then occupied by the entire Neal family when William Neal's home burns down. And then Robert's brother Henry inherits the house, and he names it after the last location he fought in the Civil War. So then the house is eventually passed to the Kappa Sigma fraternity in 1919. And this is when the house undergoes a overhaul renovation that encompasses the Neal home in a Virginia colonial style, designed to reflect the fraternity's heritage. So in doing this investigation, it appears that the Indianola house and its proof of passageways is what is offering the greatest motivation for the articulation of the Underground Railroad on campus. But as some of my research assistants and I have started to look at, we kind of have traced the history of the house. Starting in 1858, this was the Neal House, built as a kind of Swiss house. And then it was remodeled in 1938. And this is at the point where it then becomes remodeled as a Virginia colonial. By 1957, this is where these legends of these concealed passageways and false ceilings start to come in. And I will kind of trace through in 1967. The building is now full of tunnels and secret passages. And you can see down here at the bottom, my researchers have kind of updated the claims that we've gone from some concealed passages now to many. It used to be a tunnel from the basement to High Street. That's now been updated to running all the way to the river. Then it kind of goes even further, and we now know sometime in the 1970, there's an article where they identify now there are 4 secret concealed passages. There's a secret room, there's a tunnel through a porch pillar. So you can kind of see how the narrative just kind of keeps expanding and going until the final kind of versions of it, which are still evolving as we speak. But what we started to do was, well, let's get to the bottom of this architectural mystery. Let's go to the Ohio Historic Society and find the original plans of the Neal family house as it was renovated into the Kappa Sigma fraternity. And this was a really incredible find because it's not cataloged in the archive. Somewhere in the midst of all of this, I had caught the name of an architect and I said, I wonder if that person has anything to do with the firm that I know today, which goes by the name of Schooley Caldwell. And I reached out to them and I said, do you know anything about this house? And they said, well, yes, this was like the great great grandfather. And it was his previous business partner. They were renovating. They did a lot of fraternity and sorority houses in Columbus in the early 20th century. So this was a kind of an amazing find. So what we started to do was unpack the house. We started to look at like, okay, well, how did the Swiss house, which I have here rendered in blue, how did it become the colonial house, and start to look at the different layers and the kind of understanding of that. The house itself was wrapped with this new house. And as a result of that, there are all these kind of funny passageways. And so is it possible that instead of this being the Underground Railroad, this is actually just a set of passageways or like spaces between walls that are the result of an architectural renovation? My students made this really wonderful drawing where they were kind of trying to see the 2 houses, like the house within the house, or one house wrapped in the identity of another house. And this trick was really kind of fun. They used this red and blue drawing trick, which you can see here in blue is the Swiss house. And then in red is the fraternity house. And then you can kind of look and see how the 2 passages, how one house used to be for a 19th century family, and now the house is for a 21st century fraternity. And when we presented all of this information to the board of Kappa Sigma, we gave them these like little 3D movie glasses so that they could sort of flicker between the 2 houses. So it was kind of an interesting drawing trick. But let me tell you a little bit more about how we expanded this. So this project starts to show us that in solid white, which is a 3D print, I printed the 1842 Swiss house. So we start with the Swiss house and then added on in this kind of transparent blue, the 1938 Virginia colonial house. That was what was the addition in blue. And then the orange was the addition that was done in the 1970s. And so this kind of modeling technique allows you to kind of see the layers of transformation that have happened over time. So there it is a little bit from above. Here we are on the side. So that ghost of the original Swiss house, it's still present within the 1938 Virginia colonial house. And just to refresh your memories of what that looks like, there's the original Swiss house on the hill, and then there's the update. And what they did, you can see here, is that this kind of starts to explain the Underground Railroad according to the legend. And so this area of the house, between the blue facade and the white 3D print, between the Virginia facade wrap and the Swiss original, this is the area that is claimed to be the Underground Railroad. So when touring the house and taking a look with some of these things, some of my fraternity colleagues then allowed me to kind of dig into some of the parts of their project. And I will show you here in the next slide, this model gets pulled apart, and I can kind of show you a little bit how this works, where I sort of printed this model to kind of take a look at it. And so inside is this chimney stack, or a stack that's next to the chimney. And this stack is what has been identified. This is like the secret room. And it's really just a kind of vestige of some architectural kind of holdovers. So in looking at the original, the blueprints of the house, you can then see here in the green area, or that little rectangle that just bounced through, that's the stack. There is the stack there on the basement, right? So we start to see how these, or excuse me, that's on the first floor plans. And if you look at how that all starts to come together there on the basement, there's that space once again. And so everybody's talking about this as a non-architectural space, but it's actually a very important space in the structuring of the foundations. And it was built not as a part of the Underground Railroad, but if anything, as a part of the chimney. So as we start to get into the last 10 minutes of our presentation here, the next project that I'm going to talk about is who made the Underground Railroad. And this is this project that I presented at the Newberry Library in the Crossings exhibition. And I will click through some of this a little bit quickly just for the sake of expediency. But making this project was a way of starting to look at some maps of 19th century, the Midwest, and we wanted to compare that to Seibert's map. So we redrew these, made a data set that we could then compare different infrastructures such as the canal or the stagecoach or the railroad, and compare that to some of the routes that people used to kind of escape out of enslavement. But the big thesis that we wanted to kind of emphasize here is that the Underground Railroad wasn't just safe houses coordinated by white abolitionists, but actually a series of unpredictable routes, landscape structures, and spaces spontaneously invented by Black men and women seeking liberation. And I will do my best right now. I'm going to show you a little bit of some of the snippets of the animation. This is kind of what was present in the gallery. And the internet is a little laggy, but maybe we'll just give ourselves some time to appreciate that, see how this is starting to come in. But here we were telling the story of infrastructure, and then another infrastructure emerged during this time, which is the Underground Railroad. And then we start to kind of think about the different ways that we could start to see the mapping as a kind of attempt to that. But one of the big parts of this project was that the Underground Railroad, who is telling the story of the Underground Railroad? And I'll just very quickly kind of talk about this in relation, the typical ways that the stories of the Underground Railroad have been presented is in 4 different ways. The first is through Frederick Douglass, or through Black men and women who are writing about their own escapes in their own voices. So, for example, Frederick Douglass, he himself was enslaved. He escaped out of enslavement. He wrote and published himself. There are also, such as the story of, Harriet Beecher stories, which was represented and kind of sort of written as with the help of a white woman who was a literate could write. She represented Harriet's story on behalf of Harriet. So there's this kind of other dynamic of somebody who was enslaved, but their story is being told on behalf of themselves by somebody else. Then there are the abolitionists, primarily white abolitionists, who are writing and publishing about the evils of slavery at the time. And then finally, there are in later years, through the Works Public, the WPA projects, and through the Seibert archive, we have primarily white interview collectors receiving stories from Black men and women who were enslaved and how they kind of escaped out of enslavement. Now, these dynamics are really important to recognize because different power dynamics or different stories are told in slightly different ways. And so knowing who the author is and who is publishing the story is a really important part of the dynamics. So when we put together the interview when we put together the animation, we wanted to be cognizant of having a breadth of different experiences and a breadth of different narrators and storytellers. So I will give you a little bit of the overview of Edward Moxley. And Edward Moxley was, let's see, we'll start that. Here we go. He was enslaved in Kentucky, and he found his way out of enslavement, and he wrote and published. Well, this is a story actually that was in the Seibert archive. So he's reporting the story to somebody who's collecting his testimony. And so here we're telling the story of how he kind of escaped from his homestead to the river, and then he took the boat to Cincinnati, shoved the boat adrift, and then everybody walked up. They got to Dayton, and then when they arrived at Dayton, they met a Black man named Jim Smith, who offered to take them to Portland. But Jim Smith was not a friend to us. He was an enemy. And actually Jim Smith went to alert kidnappers for the reward money. And so there was a big kind of chaotic, sort of flight. Some people were captured, others were able to move on ahead, and then eventually found their way to Portland, which is now Sandusky, and then across Lake Erie to Canada. And the same thing that we started to kind of talk about with William Wells Brown, a sort of set of conditions. And I will just jump into that narration really quickly now. Let's see. Does it want to go? It doesn't seem to want to go. There it goes. Okay. So William Wells Brown, he wrote about his own escape out of enslavement. And this story was much larger in spatial scope. So how to tell the story of moving from New Orleans all the way up to Ohio, which is much, much different than Cincinnati to Lake Erie. And so the story goes that he arrived by boat in Cincinnati and he slipped out. He was being traveled with his enslavers. And then when they got to public landing in Cincinnati, Ohio, he was able to slip into the crowd and kind of disappear, and taking advantage of the fact that Black men and women were free in Ohio. And so he was sort of able to blend in and kind of hide himself and sort of represent himself as a free Black man. And of course, the stories of the North Star and other navigational devices, very important in being able to figure out which direction or which way you were going, as most people did not have a map to go with them. And so they were just kind of making up their journeys out of enslavement on the fly. Great. I will really quickly finish with the story of Eliza Harris, because you're probably all very familiar with her story. She was an enslaved Black woman in Kentucky who, when hearing that her child was to be sold to another family of enslavers, escaped in the night through the wintry Kentucky landscape to the Ohio River, where she planned to walk across the Ohio River with her baby, the frozen Ohio River, with her baby in her arms. And her experiences were dramatized in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And her dramatic escape has been pictorialized many times in books, paintings, or sheet music. And this image of Eliza crossing the breaking ice is very harrowing. but it's also a very familiar trope from the 19th century. So you can see here John Gast's American Progress. There's this kind of familiarity or similarity with her. And I will really quickly just point out three things about these three images that I think is very interesting. In the first one, on the left, the viewer, we are part of the kidnappers. We're standing on the sides of the river, right? We're standing in Kentucky watching Eliza flee. And then in the middle one, we're seeing Eliza. We are standing with her in the middle of the river, kind of watching her, or actually, no, I'm sorry. We're standing in Ohio looking at her coming towards us, and we see her enslavers beyond. And then in the final one here in the middle, we are in the river with her. And so it's a kind of interesting way to think about how do you start to develop these kinds of sense of empathy or different kinds of acknowledgments. Taking Eliza's story apart, I will just really quickly move through some of these things. And we've talked about this before. So different phases of her story, thinking about the Rankin house, the different aspects of the different Parker or other abolitionists. And so those were then translated into these representations to put on this map. I found documentation for the Ripley, Ohio, and very carefully started redrawing the Ripley, Ohio from the late 19th century or the mid 19th century. I was very delighted to discover in my research a Black Wesleyan Black church, Wesleyan Methodists. The Black churches were a very big part of the Underground Railroad network. And while this building was not noted on the National Parks tour of Ripley, Ohio, I was delighted to discover a marker indicating that this church, which stood at this site now that is a playground, was actually a big part of the abolitionist history of the town. So even though the building does not stand any longer, the town is recognizing the significance of those contributions. And so I will finish up here with thinking about now we don't know where Eliza came from or where she was enslaved. So I selected a kind of prototypical central Northern Kentucky plantation house. And in this case, I chose the one that is sort of understood as my old Kentucky home. And from this side, it looks like a very, dignified mansion. But when you look at it from up above, you can see that wing extending from the, my old Kentucky Howe Museum. That back wing is all of the services. So that's where the kitchens were, or that's where some of the slave quarters were. But it's a part of the way that the kind of house hides the presence of the infrastructure and the people who are making the house work. So that became the kind of translation into this representation. Okay, and then we will go from here to here, and I'm just about finished. Let's see. Okay, and then I will show the final story of Eliza Harris. Nope, I really will, I promise. Okay. Try it again. And a lot of the readings that I had done about reading the landscape or understanding the details of the ground became really important in how to start drawing and visualizing these different systems. So following a topography line or a stream, thinking about the kind of relationships between riverbanks and houses or buildings and how one might start to depict this kind of harrowing journey from one site to the next. Or even moving through the town, kind of finding one's way first to the Ripley house. But then, John Rankin, did not keep everybody at his parsonage, but there was quite a network of people or different individuals. And so we're trying to represent that kind of complexity of that network. So with my last slide, as we conclude kind of all of this thinking and pulling apart the stories that shape our cultural mores and values around how we think about enslavement, how we think about the Underground Railroad, it has really kind of been a very fascinating historical and sort of representational drawing, a kind of an architectural archaeology of pulling apart these stories and delving into the different threads that start to shape our perceptions about the way that we see the world and about the way that we communicate about the Underground Railroad. Thank you so much. And I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen at this moment, and perhaps we can move on to questions or something like that from that point of view.
So our first question here in the chat function from Richard asks, did your research cover any travels up the Des Plaines River into Wisconsin?
It has not yet. The archive that I've been working with has been primarily focused on Ohio, which is very convenient for me because I can very quickly just kind of take a day trip and sort of see some of these verifications. So I have not gotten into the sort of larger Midwestern region, but if you have any stories or information, I would love to hear them.
I have a question.
Yes.
Was there any place near Kenton, Ohio? Not Canton, but Kenton, Northwest Ohio, about 60 miles from Columbus?
6 or 60?
60.
I was going to say Kenton,
Mhm.
Ohio. I'm sure well, I haven't looked, but the Seibert archive is available online. It's searchable. And actually, I can probably throw the link into the chat really quickly. And you might be
I'll
able to
tell
look
you
something
why. I'm not from Ohio, but my husband was. He grew up in rural Ohio, a farm land. He's an Ohio Stater, played for Woody Hayes, and I think
Oh, wow. He's like royalty.
I think this might have been his fraternity, but he's not here for me to ask. But the reason is, so he was born in 1943, and grandma, so was at least, it was like 100 years before that. And when she died, as in a rural farm community, there's a big thing out in front of the barn where all the stuff goes out and people bid on it. And I picked up a doll that was about that high, that was crocheted or knitted with a red dress and a black body. Now, I have never seen a Black person in Kenton, Ohio. I don't think there were any farmers around there who used Black help. Amish was big. And I've always wondered, where did this doll come from? And it's near the Scioto River. Did anyone ever use the Scioto River?
I mean, certainly rivers are, were a way of navigating, but I mean, it definitely could be. It definitely
was just
could
an
be.
anomaly that something like that would be in possession.
I mean, it could even be like a lot of times very seldomly did children escape out of enslavement. It was just so dangerous. But from my understanding is that a lot of times people would just kind of hide themselves. If there was a barn door open, they might just slip in during the night and then leave before anybody noticed. Or there were different landscapes that people kind of found themselves in. So it very well could have been that somebody hid and left the doll behind. I think that's what you're sort of alluding to a little bit. But I don't know. I mean, I know that Amish doll making, they have like the sort of faceless dolls.
Well, this
It wasn't that though.
No. What were the prime years of the Underground Railroad in Ohio?
So primarily between the 1830s up until the Civil War.
So that would be that time,
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, thank you. I will look up I'll see if I can throw that the Seibert archive at the
Okay.
Ohio History Connection and see if we can find anything. But
All
thank you
right.
for that
Well, that would be
question.
good. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Sue. We have another question from Sharon, who says, you mentioned an exciting book published this year related to your topic. Can you give us any more information about that book?
I sure can. Let's see. I can Google it right now. Let's see. William Still, New York. Okay, Times one. No, that's not it. Okay. It's a book called Vigilance: The Life of William Still by Andrew K. Deemer. And I will copy that. This is the professor in me. And I'll throw that in the chat for everybody too. But I just read it this winter. It was really great.
And then Richard made a comment as well, says, there was a stagecoach stop in Bristol, Wisconsin that participated in the Underground Railroad and had a tunnel from the stagecoach stop back to a farm a few hundred yards further north.
So I am suspicious of stories of tunnels. And the reason why is that it seemed like, and it was funny, like I gave a version of this presentation to the Society of Architectural Historians, and every architectural historian was like, oh, there's a story of a tunnel. Like the tunnel is always going along with the stories of these spaces. Even when I grew up in Connecticut, I remember like my brownie troop, like going to a house in Woodbury, Connecticut. And they said, oh, there's a tunnel under the road, and we think that's the Underground Railroad. I don't know. I don't think that tunnels were very, very, very rare. I could be wrong. Like this might actually be, there might be a tunnel here, and that would be something interesting for us to think about. But far more often than not, tunnels were not really the tool that was being used for people to find their escapes. People were kind of escaping. They were hiding in the woods more so than they were traveling through a tunnel. And so that's something, it's a surefire way to start poking some questions at something. If somebody tells you there's a tunnel, you can be like, well, is there a tunnel? Have you seen the tunnel? Who built the tunnel? And as I kind of mentioned, and Colson Whitehead also talks about this in his really incredible work, it's like, yeah, who do you think was building infrastructure in America in the 1850s? It was not white people. So this idea that there are all these kind of benevolent abolitionist tunnels that were running around the landscape is something to think about. So.
Karen, I did have a question, if you could bear with me.
I will bear with you. I'd be delighted to bear with you. Yeah.
I think this would be a good question for everyone else in the audience as well, while we await some other questions. In our current exhibit, one of the first panels that we have on display speaks directly on Lake Forest's involvement in the Underground Railroad. I know a lot of people come in asking if Lake Forest was an Underground Railroad stop, particularly in relation to one of the town's most prominent mayors, a man by the name of Sylvester Lind, who was a very well-known abolitionist, and people have speculated that his house was a stop on the Underground Railroad and things like that. And we kind of do our best to not play too much into that as a fact. We do mention that he was a very well-known abolitionist, a very outspoken abolitionist for his time in relation to everyone else. And I thought your mentioning of the agents really fascinating as well. What surprised you in your research about the involvement to any degree, whether it was very timid involvement or very outspoken involvement of people in relation to participating in the Underground Railroad, whether as agents or as just, like you mentioned, that idea of kind of the friendly families not so much being true, but what kind of surprised you on that front?
Well, I think I just finished a project working with the city of Westerville, Ohio, which similarly has a history of some prominent families who are abolitionists. And I think one of the things that has surprised me, let me think. What has really surprised me is with respect to like a house owned by a person, if that house was part of the sort of station on the Underground Railroad, and I use that word very loosely, it was often because that person had an incredible social standing and had a lot of like privilege and sort of protection. And so that person was not, it was definitely somebody who had a lot of prestige in the town. And that seems to be a common thread, that in order to do the work in the way that we've been told about the stories, there was a kind of a type of a kind of bravado or sort of arrogance or just impenetrability that allowed people to do that type of work that we've heard about. But the majority of the work of the Underground Railroad was the skilled work of people who actually were escaping slavery. And so it was the creativity and the intelligence and the ingenuity and the spontaneity to be able to come up with an Underground Railroad at any given time, to read the landscape so well, or to read the situation so well that you could pivot on a moment's notice and not go that way, but go that way, or be able to, I think about how people could read situations, people who've been under an incredible amount of trauma and who have been under highly abusive scenarios have a real skill to like read a room real fast or to read a situation very quickly. That's something that I think really stays with me quite a bit as I read these narratives of people who escaped enslavement, like just the sheer like terror and the incredible bravery and intelligence that goes into that. But of course too, like it's harder to hold on to they don't have a material artifact that goes with them. Maybe Sue's statement about the doll, that's maybe one representation that could start to think, but houses, they tend to stick around. But the rest of the Underground Railroad, it was like not made out of anything. So it's really fascinating to think about.
Yeah, that's a really great point. While we wait for any other questions towards the end of the segment here, that we get this conception a lot that the Underground Railroad was a railroad of route markers and trails and things like that, but not so much the case. For anyone not familiar, would you say that that was kind of just meant for layman's terms, because it sounded kind of mystical in that sense or something?
Sure, right? I mean, well, it sort of explains how it worked. And I think like what we start to do when we talk about tunnels, it's like we sort of know, oh, there clearly wasn't a train, but like we still do this. Like we kind of spatialize it. And it is a really fascinating, like the architect in me is like, wow, like it's really amazing that like we have to come up with an infrastructure, we have to come up with a hidden room, we have to come up with a passageway or trail or path or something like that in order to give this like just this incredible nebulous and totally spontaneous sort of thing, a kind of an understanding or a sort of spatial understanding. But in some of my research with the city of Westerville, there was a story about a woman who had enslaved people on her husband's property. And when he passed away, she decided that she wanted to liberate the people that were enslaved. But the laws, et cetera, were so complicated. The best way that she had to ensure everybody's safety was to wait until she died and be able to like make certain kinds of very specific plans. And so this group of people arrived in Westerville, Ohio, very large group of Black family members. The Alstons, they arrived, they settled, they started farming. And in many ways, I wrestle with the question of, did this group of people, did they arrive in Ohio through the Underground Railroad. Because it wasn't secret, it wasn't at night. Very few people were traveling at night, by the way. Frederick Douglass traveled in the middle of the day on a train, actually, of all things. So it makes me kind of wonder a little bit, like a story like that starts to pull at some of my thoughts too. Is like, okay, does a story like this, which involves an agent, but an agent who set up a series of laws to protect somebody versus like a house that received them. So I find that really, really amazing to kind of think about the difference between a sort of architectural place versus like a law that might kind of enshroud you as you moved from one place to another. I wonder how to draw that too. Like the person in me who likes to draw these things that are hard to see, like how do you draw that? That's really cool.
I'll leave us off with one final question, and I'll give some concluding remarks before we adjourn for the evening, Karen. Is there anything that you're currently working on now that kind of continues to build on this topic, or anything that you plan to work on in the future that takes this research into a more detailed direction, or maybe a different direction, or something else entirely? Yeah, is there anything you're working on at the moment?
So the thing that I'm working on right now with the house, right, the house in on campus, is that we're also, we've just acquired a heat mapping drone technology. And so we're going to be flying over the space of the Neil Run, and we're going to try to like use that technology to verify that there are no tunnels. Now, I could be completely surprised. I might find tunnels, right? Which would be really amazing if we did. I think either way, it's going to be really quite fantastic. But I have collaboration with the historians at the library here who have all the historic maps of the campus. And then also with building facilities, they have all the infrastructure, the current infrastructure. And so we're going to take that information and build like a big kind of map, an archaeological kind of layered map to show the different things that we're finding. Because with the renovation of the house, we found that they also had kind of done a type of renovation to the landscape. The house was originally sitting on a bit more of a hill, as one of the images showed, but when they changed the Swiss house to the Virginia colonial, they regraded the site to give it also this kind of Virginia colonial lawn. Hugely problematic. There's so many things that are very, very problematic in all the directions that we look at with this, but that will be a kind of interesting site to do a different type of archaeology. So the drone footage, I'm really excited about. So I'll have to come back and play the drone flights for you all.
We would love to have you back. So
You're very sweet. Yeah.
And Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for this evening's presentation. Thank you to everyone who attended this evening as well. I'll just leave us with a few concluding remarks. As I mentioned, the program tonight has been recorded and will be made available to watch free of charge on the History Center YouTube channel about next weekend. I would think that'll be up and published, and feel free to share that recording at your leisure as well. I also wanted to reiterate that this Saturday is the last day to see the Deeply Rooted and Rising High exhibit. If you're in the Lake Forest area or greater Chicago area and want to come by and see it before it's taken down, Saturday is the last day to do that. After that, we'll be celebrating the holiday season with our Whistle Stop Wonderland model train exhibit that runs through mid-January. And more information on that can be found on our main website, lflbhistory.org. And I also wanted to thank the generous support of Madeline B. Dugan and Mark Saran for continuing to make Zoom programming possible for the History Center. And thank you to all of our current members in the audience today. It is through your continued dedication and support that programs like these with wonderful guest speakers like Dr. Lewis are continued to be made possible and available free of charge to the public. So with that, Dr. Lewis, thank you again for this presentation, and thank you all for attending. And from all of us here at the History Center, have a good night, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate your time and attention. And thanks for all the great questions.